computer, and it's going. All right, here we are. This is Andy, and that's David.
Oops, what happened there? There we go. Hey. So happy to be here. Let's go.
The purpose of this conversation, and I'm just so grateful that David was willing to do this, and he and I both have wanted to do this, is to have an extended conversation with people who might have a different point of view. He just said the belief bomb. This is what I believe. You dump on someone, you call them a name, and you leave. That doesn't move the conversation forward. So he and I thought it would be good to, number one, demonstrate how to have respectful academic conversations with people who have different ideas. And number two, really explore and get down and see what the differences are and see what we agree on. And that is what brings me joy. So, yep. David, what do you think?
I agree. I mean, that's what brought us together. The post to our exchanges on LinkedIn kind of led us to recognize that both of us were open to and interested in getting beyond the, as I said, belief like ping pong, back and forth of just throwing opinions at each other. And that my proposition and the thing I think we've agreed to do here is to let's go slow and careful, and let's look at the small assumptional components that are inside of these beliefs and see if we can agree. And if we can't, why we disagree. I mean, good people can disagree. That's Absolutely. Okay. Let's understand where those disagreements are without necessarily thinking or hurling some kind of personal attack upon one another, and say, if we get stuck somewhere, let's move on. Let's keep learning. But I'd like to see us get to a place where there's a map of the constellation of assumptions that are causing all these conflicts and troubles, and that two of us are exploring those individual assumptions.
And even I disagree with me sometimes, meaning that stuff I wrote in 2016, as I continue to research and evolve and write and talk, my belief systems continue to change, and I hopefully evolve. And sometimes in the world of reading, we see what someone has written in 1985, and we say, aha, that's that person. But everyone's views evolve and change over time. So hopefully my views have evolved slightly, and it's because of having discussions with people that think differently. If we don't listen, we're not going to evolve our thinking. And no one has an exclusive view on the truth, even though I think I'm absolutely right. And David thinks he's absolutely right. And that's good.
Well, I think that for me, the way I look at this is that belief is a terrible substitute for learning, universally so, right? That belief is a stand-in, a proxy that can be very learning disabling. It can be learning enabling, and it can be learning disabling. I'm going to be really careful about what I believe and rather be open to learning, including learning about things that are different. And I agree with you. I've written stuff about reading that goes back into the late 80s, and some of it I agree with the spirit of, but I kind of cringe at the crudity with which I was expressing myself in those days.
Some of the things that's really stretched my thinking about reading is reading like neuroscience and other cognitive science and things that relate are kind of peripheral versus, to really expand how I think about the world. And even reading about the arts, if I focus too much just reading, I can get the silo effect.
Yeah, well, for me, that's why it's so important to start with where we're starting, right? To contextualize reading, right? Reading is a bubble inside an ocean of other connected things. I mean, it's important for us to dive into that. So maybe that's our cue. Let's go right into it. What is reading?
What is reading? Reading is creating meaning with print. Without creating meaning, we're not reading. As opposed to, well, where are you at with that? And then
I would say reading is an artificially inseminated language experience. a virtual language experience constructed by the brain according to the information and instructions contained in a code.
Okay. So that, that's a lot more complex than mine, David. What I think is, well, this isn't Andy talking, but what is the basis of much of the science of reading definition is what's called the simple view of reading. That reading is decoding times language comprehension is reading.
Well, that reading is taking a code and cueing back into mind memory bits of auditory language that have been stored so as to create this stream of language that you're comprehending, right? So the simple view basically says reading is an overlay to our natural oral language system that's causing us to have a language experience through code.
Well, we can agree that oral language is at the basis of reading.
Yeah, at least initially.
Yes, that one has to know a language, and what depend, you could use symbols, orthography, or the letters that we use to put things together. To put words,
all of which are the same, right? I mean, symbols and orthography and the letters we use, those are all different descriptions of the same thing.
Well, the Chinese language that use the symbols, that's processed a little bit different because they're not putting sounds together.
Some of them are.
Right. The same with sign language. It's not sounds putting together to create words.
Right. But I guess my point is that the letters are symbols and orthography is a system of symbolization. So.
Right. But there are symbols that don't put sounds to the symbols. There's
ideographic and pictographic written systems that are not based on sound, that are not alphabetic. Yes, of course.
But still you're reading that information, you're reading. That is right. You're creating meaning with print.
Yep.
So I'm trying to find out where, well, yours is really complex, David, where the differences are. Reading is creating meaning with print. So
yeah, but when you say creating, you're talking about the brain creating this.
Absolutely, you're constructing.
So the brain is following instructions, or it's following instructions or information according to how it's learned to follow instructions and information, so as to create meaning. Actually, it's creating, in the early stages of reading, we're talking about, it's creating a simulated language experience that's giving rise to meaning. Depends on whether or not, you might say that somebody who's a really skilled reader reads faster than sound. They don't hear the word. They get to the meaning without it ever going through a sound loop. But in the beginning stages, at least in alphabetic languages, during the learning process for non-deaf children, for normally hearing children, they hear the language in their mind before the meaning kicks. Yeah.
I don't know if I'd necessarily agree with that. One way or the other. I don't know if I'd necessarily agree with that. That's one of the problems I have with the simple view of reading. It seems to say that you sound out words and then listen to the words in your head as you're reading, meaning that you listen to what you're sounding out. And I see the human brain operating a little bit more with a little bit more complexity than that the human brain is a pattern seeker, and we seek patterns, things that we know. We use letter clues and other things as we read.
Are we making a distinction now, though, between somebody who's a good reader, who's recognizing a word they've learned to read in the past, so it's just boom, and now they're experiencing the meaning without having to go through the sound circuit, so to speak, as distinct from somebody who's learning to read, who's going through sound to get to word recognition, to get to meaning?
Whereas in the beginning, we tend to use a lot more letter sounds, but we don't use those exclusively. We also use context and syntax to recognize words. Recognize words is seeing a word in print and knowing exactly what it is. I recognize you. Identifying words is seeing a word, it's in your lexicon, but you don't recognize it, and you have to use some strategy. So the goal is to develop automaticity so that you're doing more recognizing than identifying. Identifying word is employing a strategy, consciously employing a strategy. Oh, there's a word. I don't recognize it. I need to consciously employ a strategy. So I don't know if that was answering your question or not, David.
I'm hearing in my worldview a kind of a bleed between what a good reader does and what somebody who's learning to read does. And maybe it's important to kind of disentangle those things. One thing I would agree with, and I have this difficulty in communicating this with the more code, the mechanical side of the code folks, right, is that when somebody's a really good reader and they're encountering a word that they recognize on site, there's no code processing going on in the way that they think of it. There's no sound, there's no super fast sound out. It's a recognizing the pattern of the thing as a whole.
Yep.
Partly primed by the contextual flow, creating a field around their anticipation and expectation that's reducing the possibilities and helping to recognize the word as a whole. So all that's going on. Question is not what a good reader does, at least for me. The question is, how does somebody who's not a good reader become a good reader? And that's where our differences with respect to the role of sound and sounding it out come in.
Reducing the possibilities, using context. You know, you're sounding a lot like Ken Goodman. No.
Well, look, my background is such that I am meaning centric in every human beings are meaning centric, yes. Right? We are that way. That is our nature. And so we are constantly in my view, we're constantly differentiating and disambiguating our way to being more present to whatever it is we're interacting with in the world. And it includes reading. That includes everything. So disambiguating our way is applicable to understanding and recognizing the meaning of a word. Even if I recognize its sound pattern, but don't understand what it means, you know, I'm employing all kinds of cues in the process. Again, the question is not what a good reader's doing. It's the question is, what is it that a beginning reader needs to do?
Good. And let me get to that question. But, you know, Ken Goodman used the term a psycholinguistic guessing game to essentially describe what you just said, you know, eliminating the possibilities as we're reading. People took
guessing's a really unfortunately loaded word, but disambiguation is different than guessing, but yes.
And maybe it was an unfortunate use of the word, but he didn't think that 30 years down the line, people would be pulling what he said out of context and saying, oh, you whole language people, you're teaching children to guess at words.
Yeah, that's why my point about why it was an unfortunate choice of words, because it led to that. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So how do beginning readers learn to read? Well,
before we get to that, I don't know that we jumped fast through our initial descriptions of reading, and you said mine was rather complicated. I think mine like my favorite Einstein quote is, make everything as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right. And the reason for that is that when you oversimplify something that really needs to be understood in a certain way, it gives rise to all kinds of nut stuff. And we've certainly seen that happen. So when you say making meaning from print, that's pregnant with all kinds of sub detail inside of what does making mean and what does meaning mean and what does print mean, you know, and how do those things come together? And what I was saying is very much like what you were saying in many respects, but it's I think it's important to recognize that this meaning that's being made is being made according to the information in the code. It's not happening in a vacuum. Right? It's like my brain is playing MP3 player and there's a stream of code coming along and I'm hearing the music. It's very much like a player piano that's playing this song of words in my mind according to information in the piano scroll, in the code that's flying by. So we need to understand that it's not the words aren't popping in from the ether or from the universe in some other way. It's being mediated by this code stream.
And maybe it's the emphasis on code, because right now I am creating meaning with the sounds coming out of your mouth. I'm
Sure.
hearing them, and it has nothing to do with codes. It has
Well,
to
it does. It has to do with speech codes. That's a
speak.
different kind of code, right? Our oral language is a code too, but it's a naturally evolved and co-evolved with the brain kind of code that our species has had hundreds of thousands of years or millions, depending on which anthropologist, cognitive anthropologist you subscribe to. We've had a long trajectory of learning to make, produce, and hear and process this code. But there is a stream. When what you're saying, you're making meaning.
Create a meaning.
You're making meaning out of my words. Well, you're overlaying my words with what you think they mean. There's still a process of taking this code from me and putting something on it. The difference between this kind of code and a written code is the written code is completely a technological artifact, whereas the speech code is a naturally evolved human communication system that's had hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary instantiation.
I know there's a difference in learning to speak and listen and learning to read and write. And sometimes whole language people are misinterpreted and saying we learn them exactly the same way. We don't. But many of the conditions that helped us learn to speak and listen are and can and should be applied to learning and to read and write, being immersed in authentic speaking conditions, for example.
Yeah, that's just jumped.
Okay.
Let's go slow. I mean,
When I hear you say code, though, little flags go up, because code based in my world, and it may be, is a code word for focusing on letter sounds, the letter code.
But I don't want to go there. I want to talk like we're two scientists who are talking. The word code just means that there's a symbol system representing something. There's an abstract representation system going on, right?
Okay, yep. So words, sounds are an abstract representation, and visual words. Okay, yep.
And visual words. Now, visual words are composed of elements. Now we can get into how those elements relate to sounds, how they relate to word recognition a little bit down the road. Right now, I'm just trying to say the difference between the two codes is that one of them evolved over a long period of time, right? Through human natural processes of paying attention to one another, seeing each other's face, hearing, tones, affective radiations, all kinds of stuff in that oral language code. The written code is an entirely different business. It's not at all comparable. It's an artificial technological construct that has been malformed in all kinds of weird ways throughout history as it comes to us.
Well, I think we can agree on what code means. And the written language is a relatively new human phenomenon. I don't know if it's a new human phenomenon. I don't see it as any more technical than learning to speak.
Oh, wow. Okay, we got to stop right there. That is the ball game right there. Right.
Well, think about it. Think about it. Initially we did not speak. Humans did not speak. We used sounds and other things to communicate. And the first type of written communication was pictures. And we're still communicating using pictures. And somewhere along the line, we had words that formed. And then somewhere along the line, they realized that if they had symbols for sounds, you could put those together and you could represent words.
Well, yeah. If you're talking about cave paintings 40,000, 50,000 years ago, even before that, we started scratching on bones to indicate counting, tallies and what have you like that, which were the first kind of symbol representations. Some, arguably 7,000 to 6,000 years ago, we started using various other forms of writing systems, from pictographic and ideographic to cuneiform, etc. And then around 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago, comes the alphabet, which spreads around the planet. The difference is, for example, just to speak, let's focus our conversation on the alphabet related codes. Okay. I mean, yes, there's comparisons that we could make between ideographic and pictographic written systems and the differences that they represent. And that's a fascinating conversation. And if you want to, we can put aside an episode. But if this core conversation about reading, I think it would be helpful for the people that are paying attention, or are both paying attention to us inside the English language world, right? If we talked about the alphabet. And with respect to the alphabet, we're talking about something that's a radically different kind of code. And let me give you one quick example. In the 8th century BC, the writing systems that were used, for example, Plato in the Republic says, when we learned the letters of the alphabet, we could read. That was it. End of story. There was an initial phoneticism to the Hebrew, Phoenician, Greek, and early stage Roman alphabet, meaning that there was no correspondence confusion between a letter and its sound.
Well, I think I would agree with you that it is a technical innovation, putting symbols to sounds. But, and again, the idea that it's something totally different. And I don't know,
Yeah.
I'm not explaining myself very well here. That
I think this is important.
Yeah, that the basic process of learning to read involves decoding, involves letters and sounds. Most of us agree with that. Yes.
But I don't.
Well, let me.
Decoding is way too simple a word for the kind of disambiguation of the code that's the bottleneck here.
When we talk about the code, and again, to me, that is an overemphasis on letter sounds. All children beginning kindergarten can already learn to read, can already read. All children in kindergarten can already read. They may use more picture clues than letter clues, but they can create meaning with that print. They can read. Now, can they read individual words in isolation? No, but rarely do we encounter individual words in isolation. Eventually, they learn to put letter sounds together through contextual instruction.
You're jumping way down the road here.
Okay,
well, I'm down the road here.
Sorry to jump.
Well, again, we said we were going to go slow and kind of into the assumption set, and it challenged me. I'm like, that's why we're here, right?
Absolutely.
We're here to learn together, right? So, and I appreciate that.
And David,
all I'm saying is that
go ahead.
Going into the how the kids are reading down the road is secondary to our conversation about what is reading, and inside of that conversation, the role of the code. And our conversation about the code got to a point a few moments ago where you were making a comparison between its comparative learnability to speech code. And I'm suggesting that comparison is a huge problem. And I want to go into that so that's the ground, because before we go on to all the other conversations about letter sounds and their mess and whether to work around them or to come up through them, I mean, back to what I was saying about the early phoneticism, the kind of confusion involved in the way that the code of today maps to the sound system of English is a consequence of a series of massive moments of negligence and ignorance and accidents in the history of how the alphabet goes from the Roman Latin to the English language we use it with today.
Okay. And just for our listeners, David and I agreed this would not be a debate. We're not here to debate. Yeah. No. So it's never going to be that. It's going to be a discussion to see. Now, when you get into the history, I personally have not invested a lot of time looking at the history of what was. When I say children learn in the same way, I'm looking at current research that uses naturalistic observational research to observe children learning. I'm thinking of Brian Camborne in particular, how children learn to use print. So to me, what they did 5,000 years ago, okay, it's interesting. It's interesting.
No, but it's not about the history. It's about, so one of my background dimensions is in processing, is in computers, in how a modem works, how various types of transmitted information streams in the internet work, how a computer takes in a code and turns that code into a video. Like right now, what people are seeing, if they're watching this, is a representation of us and our sound and what have you that's been completely encoded in a digital stream of ones and zeros that's being unfolded by their computers to create this experience of us, right? Now, the way that code processing works, the way that code and the machine that works that code to turn it back into images and sounds that look like and sound like us, there's an ecology to that universe of how that works, right? We wouldn't let any machine in the world run a code like this code that our kids have to learn to read with.
Right. And I don't know if you're making the analogy that coding and reading is similar to the code in computers. The metaphor of the human brain as a wet computer, it may have helped us initially, but I don't think that carries us very far. Human beings don't process like computers. We see things more holistically. I'm not processing a series of symbols or sounds right now to create meaning with what you're saying. So my brain,
you are processing symbols in the sense that my voice and my words, and first of all, I'm going to really agree with you that the parallels between a computer and the human brain are very dim, and we have to be very careful with them. I'm not trying to overgeneralize that model. I am trying to say that the kind of code processing that a human being does when they're reading is a completely artificial kind of code processing compared to the natural kind of code processing we do in other situations. And I mean by that, for example, and this is a really important distinction that I think reading sits upon, is that reading involves an artificial kind of learning, in that, for example, in learning to taste or talk or smell or touch or dance or move or walk or do any number of other things, the human being is guided by internal proprioceptive feedback on the live edge of their participating in whatever it is they're learning to do, right? I mean, whereas in the case of reading, rather than having this kind of internal proprioceptive tuning system involved in how they're recognizing what's right and wrong, they have to defer that to the external authority of the way that thing's supposed to be. It's completely an artificial learning challenge and an artificial code relationship.
All right, I'm going to simple up what you just said.
Okay, good.
I don't think learning of any kind is artificial. I think learning is a natural human thing. We are hardwired to learn.
But we're not hardwired to learn. You don't make a distinction between learning to walk and talk and learning to use a computer?
Learning, one you do naturally and one you have to learn how to use. Learning.
Well, no, not only that, you have to conform to the external authority of a human invention rather than to a natural differentiation. When I'm learning to walk, I feel myself fall. Nobody needs to tell me that.
Yes.
When I'm learning to talk, right, I'm feeling my mouth and tongue, and
there are natural human things that we learn. We instinctually learn how to crawl, how to walk, how to speak. Absolutely. Right. But the human creature is naturally hardwired to learn. That's what enabled our species to survive.
Well,
If you put two kids in a room,
hardwired is,
if you put two kids in a room with an empty box, eventually they're going to open that box to see what's in it. That is the essential essence of learning. And
yeah, I mean, for me, learning is the central dynamic of presence extension in all life forms, including humans, right? So it's the process through which we become more extensively present. I had a conversation with the Oxford neuroscience team who identified the place in the brain that was the most uniquely human part they could find, that they wrote all kinds of papers about. So I asked them, was this part of the brain a consequence of a structural, maturational, genetically driven development, or was it a unfolding, interactive, adaptive process? And they said, oh, it's totally adaptive, meaning that, yes, the most central thing that makes humans humans is learning. But there's a difference between natural modes of learning where the reference for learning is internal and artificial modes of learning where the reference for learning is a human invention. Totally different business. And
well,
it is this
I guess I would agree with you there. And that's not the point. You know, the point is that humans are naturally inclined to learn.
Yeah, there's no difference.
Yeah, whether it's something they do naturally, you know, learning to speak and listen, or learning how to play tennis or do a computer, or learning how to read. But
you just blurred together. For example, learning to play tennis, the tennis is artificial, but learning it isn't. The rules are artificial, but the activity, the somatic activity of physically hitting the ball and running around, you're learning to do that. You're through proprioceptive tuning, through self-perceptive tuning, like you are when you're a baby learning to walk and talk and so forth.
I think we agree on that, yes, there's things that humans naturally learn, and there's other things.
Right.
There's
and I'm saying that the kind of other things that are artificial, some artificial things we learn naturally, like playing baseball. Right.
I don't know if I would separate it between artificial. I don't like the word artificial, because
well, artificial simply means it was made by humans as opposed to evolved in nature. What's wrong with that?
Well, artificial, you know, is learning how to throw a rock. Artificial is learning how to run from a tiger. Artificial, you know.
No, humans didn't invent the rock or the tiger. So no, learning how to use a computer, learning how to do mathematics, learning how to read, learning how to write.
I guess I don't like the word artificial. You know,
well, but so let's challenge that. Why not? What's wrong with the word artificial for making an important distinction between these different modalities of participation?
For me, you know, it's the natural instinctual kinds of things we learn, and there is other learning. You know, I see learning as developing cognitive structures, expanding neural networks. That's what learning is. That occurs as a result of experience. I learn as a result of experience. I learn certain things, having relationships. Is that learning? Is that artificial learning? What I learned from a relationship? I learned from experience. Is that an artificial? You know,
depends on the experience. It depends on whether or not the learning involves you having to conform to the conventions of an external human invention rather than to something that's natural. I think that's an important distinction that pervades the problems of education. Our lack of appreciation of this distinction, and reading sits atop of this as a crown in a way. So
what I see is those who put learning as something that is done to human beings to manipulate them to a predetermined outcome. You know, when we say artificial, I'm thinking of rats in a Skinner cage, and we need to do something. Learning is something we do to children. They get learned at. And I come from the point that learning is natural. We create the conditions whereby children can learn. They're not learned at. they learn.
Yeah. Now you're way off on a tangent here. I mean, on the one hand, I agree with what you just said. For me, if you took any time to look into my history, I'm all about what I call stewarding the health of children's learning, and that learning is the central dynamic of being human in every dimension of our existence. But I think that it's a mistake to blur together learning challenges that are natural, meaning they can be learned by differentiating your own first person internal somatic experience, and learning that requires you to conform your behavior to an external human invention. That's two different kinds of things. And the difference is we evolved for the first, and the second one we did not evolve to do. The second one has a different kind of dependency with respect to learning.
I guess I'm not seeing the importance of the distinction. I'm going right towards this natural human inclination to learn. And one of the problems why learning does not occur, and I guess I'm more school-centered, is because they don't tap into this natural inclination to learn. Children naturally want to learn. Something happens by second or third grade where we stomp all of that out of children, where they hate school. They don't like to read. What do we do to kids who come to kindergarten ready and eager to learn? I think that is the essential question.
Look, in 1985, I wrote a paper called The Insidious Curriculum, which is entirely what you just said, that the majority of our kids, because they're proprioceptively, I mean, on the one hand, we've got studies that are just, even today, we can't get AI and robotics to do what a baby can do. They're so miraculous in their ability to extend their presence into the world, learn their way into the world, right? Until they hit the artificial walls of the way humans organize the world. That's where they have their problems. And there, because of the way we think about learning, they get into a situation where they think there's something wrong with them because they're not meeting the expectations of the system they're in. And what I call shame out. They become shame averse to staying in the participation, which is what causes this massive dropout and erosion of participation as we go into school. And that part of the artificial thing is the school itself, but the biggest crown jewel of it is reading.
I guess I'm coming back to that kindergarten kid in first grade. And schools weren't always as artificial as they are today. They weren't always the factory model that they are today. There was an era where things were done differently. And there are places today, holistic education, where it's done differently today. Yep. I'm still coming back to that.
Waldorf and all of that. Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah,
I understand that. And most of them are kind of reading averse in certain ways about delaying when kids start reading and so forth.
Well, there is quite, and I can't quote the guy, but studies looking at the age at when children began reading.
Right.
6 years old was the age when they should begin formalized reading instruction. The idea that we're going to start something sooner, meaning they'll be further along later on, is just absolute silliness.
That's institutional management convenience for the machinery of
yet we have
education.
People outside of education who don't know about child development. That
on the other hand, if you wait too long, one of the things that's connected to the why 6 years old and not 7 years old or 8 years old is that you want to start the process of learning to read before the self-consciousness gets to the point where they're more vulnerable to shaming out.
Well, of course,
so there's both.
Well, two things there. By starting this early kindergarten formal instruction, you're creating winners and losers. It's called developmentally appropriate instruction. The human brain develops and thinks differently at different stages. And kindergarten is not first grade for a reason, because it's kindergarten. Children learn through play.
But this all depends on the early life learning trajectory of children with respect to their vocabulary, with respect to their speed of processing, with respect to their emotional resilience and frustration tolerances, and all kinds of other variables that go into whether or not they're sufficiently ready to take on the challenge.
Yeah. Is that a fancy way of saying children develop at different speeds and levels?
Well, I want to put it on learning.
The environment impacts us. Absolutely.
Well, the environment is a learning environment. It doesn't impact us in a mechanical way.
it impacts, we are organism, it impacts us. That's why the one size fits all curriculum is absolutely silly, because humans are not standardized products. And that's why the
So
science,
again, we've kind of bled all over the place now, and I say I think we should try to go back to, we got stuck with artificial, and I
yes, we did. We
understand.
got stuck on that
I,
term. And
I, and I understand that that's
in
problematic.
proprioceptors.
Well, proprioception is the central dynamic of human learning in the natural world, right? Um, just to mean self-perception, that I sense it. When I touch
Anyway,
an object, I know I touched it. I don't. Nobody needs to tell me I touched it or explain it to me. When
yes.
I'm walking, nobody needs to give me an abstract understanding of how my knee works in order
So
to use my knee.
artificial learning, and the word artificial, I have trouble with that, and I need to maybe think on that. So I don't know if I can come to your place right now where there's technical learning and then there's other human learning. I know there is,
Technical is a different term. Artificial is just making the distinction between whether or not the kind of learning requires the brain to conform to a system of human invention as opposed to respond to internal fluctuations. That's
yeah,
a difference. You
yeah,
can
yeah.
see the value. You can't see the value of that difference.
Well, we're always responding to external and internal environments, whether
But
it's
it,
human made or natural made, we're
but
always
that's not.
responding. As I
But
before,
an internal difference in sensing that I'm falling or in listening to the tone of your voice is one I don't need to interpret.
right.
I can sense that for myself. It's first person sensible.
But when I'm
Understanding how this letter relates to that sound, that requires knowledge from the outside world to as an interpreter.
Yes, as I am deer hunting in the woods and connecting that movement to that deer, that is also external. I don't see that as artificial.
I didn't say it was.
It's or technical. It is occurring in the external world. So I am learning to associate sounds with events.
The distinction I made wasn't artificial, it wasn't external world, it was human invented.
Yes, human invented, human
invention.
invented. So whether it's human invented or found in nature, I guess the learning is the same. How is something a human invented different from learning how to interpret sounds and signals and tracks in the natural world?
In that it requires interpretation rather than it requires a interpretation according to a system of thought external to you.
All right, a system of thought.
So you're tracking a bear. You're tracking a bear, and you see a footprint. There's an intuitive relationship between your intention to track the bear and that footprint, right? If you see a symbol down there that requires you to have learned the symbol system in order to know what it means, that's entirely different than seeing the track of the bear.
And there is a system of nature. There is a system in nature. And that's probably a little more abstract than you want to get. But you are learning to associate tracks with something else, regardless of my intention. I may not intend to track the bear or not. And this is way too philosophical. But the point is that learning occurs, whether humans created it or not. When I go into a social situation, humans interacting, I'm learning something. Was the interaction, was that a human created experience? No, that's something that naturally occurs. So I don't know if this difference relates.
If you look at the difference in the kind of processing that's involved in something that's natural, like dancing, like walking, like talking, like.
Yeah, we process different stimuli differently. I guess I could agree with that. We process different things differently. Different parts of our brain operate differently. I process music differently than I process reading.
For example, yesterday, neurology report from Germany or somewhere in Europe came out comparing the difference in brain architecture that's in support of Arabic versus German languages. And they said that the infrastructure in the brain that was learned to process German was entirely different than Arabic, even though it's still inside the auditory processing system. And that the reason for it is that the German was more interpreted, meaning that you needed to understand more rules to be able to understand the meaning of a word than you did in Arabic, right?
Yes.
So therefore there was different brain structures involved because of the semantic contextual interpretation requirements of reading German. So the brain had to be
the
different
difference
there.
in brain structure, is that a cause or is that an effect? That's an effect of being exposed to different language systems.
Well, not just being
Different
exposed
neural
of
connections.
trying to learn
Yes,
a language system that depends on a different kind of abstract knowledge to interpret it.
a different language system, absolutely. Different processes. You know, there's the experiment of the London taxi cab drivers whose neural networks developed differently, expanded because of having to have that knowledge. There's experiments where they sewed up a rat's eye or both eyes, and their brains developed, the neural networks developed differently. That's
Of
not
course. Yeah.
a cause, it's a result. So if we're talking about structural differences, I would posit that that is an effect, not a cause. It's an effect of what they were exposed to.
It's the result of their learning, right? In both cases, it's the result of their learning. If they weren't
Their
learning,
exposure,
there wouldn't be any change.
absolutely.
Well,
Absolutely.
exposure takes learning out. It's like saying a piece of film, I've exposed it to the film that had no choice but to react to the way it was exposed. Learning has a participatory quality to it that film exposure doesn't. So the word exposure, for example, takes agency out.
Well, you have to be cognitively engaged to learn. We are learning all the time. You
Yep.
know, I guess I don't separate formal learning from the learning that naturally occurs. I guess I make the distinction in degree and cognitive engagement. But learning is learning. It's forming neural networks and recreating neural networks. That's what learning is. From a cognitive point of view, it's creating cognitive structures or reorganizing them, accommodation or assimilation. That's what learning is.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that we could spend 2 or 3 hours on that point
I don't know if we're going any place with this.
Oversimplification.
I
Yeah.
don't. I don't know if we're going any. I don't know how this has impacted reading, but you.
Well,
think
because
the difference is
without
more important.
understanding the differerences between natural and artificial processing, I don't know how you have a conversation about reading. Reading involves a technological artifact, and the processing of a technological artifact at the high speed rates that speed up that can occur with language is radically different than anything else the human brain does.
I don't know if it's radically different. What about reading music then? Would that be the same thing, the same artificial construct?
Yes, you could argue about the difference in the coherence of correspondences and the different levels of interpretation in reading music, but yes, I would say that it's also artificial. Yeah.
Yep, the notation is artificial. Absolutely.
Yep. Yeah. And that therefore it requires abstract interpretation in a way that there isn't an abstract interpretation in other natural modes of learning. And that the problem with reading is that not only is it an abstract interpretation, it's an abstract interpretation of a code that is a mess.
And I think we agree on that, but people were able to learn music before formal notation existed.
Sure.
People were learned to play. People were learned to speak before formal notation. All right. So
course, yeah.
we agree it's an abstract representation of something. I think I agree with you. It's an abstract representation of language. Reading.
Right. Now what's the difference? So that's good. That's a good place to be. Now let's go to the next step. It's an so how is it different than the abstract representation of oral language? What's the difference?
How is reading different than the abstract?
I mean,
Reading,
both are abstract symbol codes. I mean, a phoneme is an abstract representation of a sound unit that we use to
yes.
construct recognition of words and that give us meaning, right? So it's an abstraction system too. But reading is a different kind of abstraction system, yes?
Reading is an abstract representation of oral language.
Very good. All right, good. So now, what's the difference between that abstraction of oral language and the abstract ways that oral language work otherwise? I mean, it's a technological artifact. It's artificial. How can we not get to that?
That learning to read is artificial?
No, that the code is artificial and that learning to read is about processing an artificial artifact.
Learning to read is about processing an artificial. It's about processing a human invented abstract representation.
So look up artificial. It says human invented. I mean, made by the hand. It's like,
okay,
that's what artificial means.
It's an abstract representation of a human invented code system. Yes.
Okay, so all of that is what I mean by artificial. It's an abstract human invented code system. It's artificial.
Humans, I guess the word artificial, I see humans as natural. But okay, so we could agree that written language is an abstract representation of human oral language.
Yeah, it's a technological system of conventions.
There are conventions involved.
It's technological. Technology just means that humans invented it. It's an invention, right?
Okay, just like oral language is a technological invention. Humans invented oral language.
No, oral language invented humans. They co-evolved.
I see your thinking there. Yes, language shapes thought. Language definitely.
Yeah, the kind of humans we are only existed in the beginning was the word, and I'm not being religious. I'm being kind of cognitive, developmental, right? Psychological.
Vygotsky.
Our ability for verbal self-reflection.
Absolutely, we are shaped by the language around us.
We are different kinds of creatures because we are.
Yeah, our thinking has evolved because of the language around us. And I think in 2,000 years, if the human species is still on this planet, they'll be looking at the internet age and seeing how our brains began to develop differently because of our exposure to things. During the factory age, we tended to think mechanically in terms of cause effect. And with the internet now, we are thinking more web-like. We don't have these lines that we had with cause effect. So I think that the early humans today, their brain is developing differently than I did growing up in the 60s and 70s.
And yet the difference between a brain 50,000 years ago and a brain today is not a neurobiological DNA difference. It's entirely learned difference.
Or 5,000 years ago. Well, the difference is a result, not a cause. That our brains evolved because of a result of something. It's an effect.
They're co-created. You can't have one without the other, just like with language. The brain evolved to produce language, and language evolved to stay within the scope of the brain evolution of language. They're co-evolved. They're symbiotic. Anyway,
now, are we masses of biology with a little intent or spirituality involved? Are we spiritual beings wrapped in flesh? Consciousness, does that evolve from physical matter, or is consciousness apart from physical matter? Consciousness.
I have great ideas about that, and that's another whole conversation.
As
we come up on the end of our hour, I think our point was what is reading, and where we've come to, right, is that in your view, it is the brain's making meaning from print. And I'm creating meaning from print. And I'm saying the process of creating meaning from print is to take is the brain is fabricating an internal experience or a spoken experience of language, it's virtualizing language according to the instructions and information contained in an artifact, in a code, in a technology, according to these conventions. It's a machine out there, right, that this is working like. So in that sense, I don't think we're any different. We have different ways of describing how do we get to this meaning making, right? And the devil's in the details about how does this meaning making get made, and how does the brain learn to make meaning from this artifact?
And I think we are similar. It's just certain words. It's this holistic educator in me when you say when artificial and technical.
Yeah, but that's the point of our conversation is to hit these little word bombs and blow them up and explode them and
absolutely
explore why we've got our emotional attachments to
and it helps
their
me understand why am I reacting to that word technical and artificial.
Right.
Why do I have this negative reaction when that is attached to a
I'm not a phonics advocate and I'm not a whole language advocate. I'm coming from an entirely different place. And so I don't have the bags going off or the neurons firing every time a word comes by. They're not loaded words for me. I'm trying to think about this, putting all that aside, like none of the reading science and none of this stuff exists. And I'm just asking the starting question, what the hell is reading?
And
and
I bring my experience that I've learned, working with children in kindergarten through grade 6, and I can't divorce myself from that experience.
No, you can't. And relative to science, and this is maybe a good closing point, one of the points that I make a lot with people in the reading science community is you can spend forever tweaking the science of how to improve the sails on a sailing ship, and it won't get you a steam engine. You can spend forever improving the science of propellers, and it won't get you a jet engine. You can spend forever improving the science of a vacuum tube, and it won't get you a microprocessor. They're all related things, but they required a complete jump in the assumption set to get from the science that was so proven and well defended in its earlier form to something that did what the first one did, but without going through its scientific corridor. And I want to do the same thing with reading.
Okay, and I would end with this. If you're a science of reading, you apply those principles to everything, meaning the cause and effect of reading difficulties. You don't use I thinkisms to think that there's a reading crisis in America. You don't use I thinkisms to say that I think that phonics is the answer. That real science applies those principles, and real science does not ignore evidence.
No, but like I just pointed out, real science is always bound inside of paradigms. It's rarely good at escaping paradigms. It's very good at paradigm fill.
And
so it always has to be
a human construction. Humans.
So it's science.
Exactly.
So science makes paradigms and then spends most of its time proving or defending them.
And people that are stuck within their paradigm, they don't grow. And some of the science of reading people are clinging to a false paradigm. Which paradigm best explains reality? And is it the cause effect paradigm? Or is it a more naturalistic, holistic paradigm?
One of my favorite things I do in my shows is there was a documentary done called The Day the Universe Changed by James Burke back in the 80s. I don't know if you remember it. It was really good. It opened up with a picture of James Burke sitting on a coast with the sun coming up over the back of his head. And he said, he recalled the Wittgenstein joke when Wittgenstein a bunch of people came up to Wittgenstein and asked him, what a bunch of morons those people in the Middle Age must have been to think that the sun was going around the earth. To which Wittgenstein replied, well, I wonder what it would look like if it would have. That you see what your knowledge tells you to see.
Yes, your paradigm. And that was the science of the day.
Yep. And this is the science of today. And the defense of it is retarding our learning.
Clinging too tightly to a paradigm. Anyway. Is that a good place to end our first session?
I think so. And next time we can talk about learning to read instead of what reading is. Yeah.
Okay, I think we agreed on some things, and it was interesting nonetheless.
Yep. All right.
All right, sir. I appreciate you. I'm going to stop the recording,
All right. Sounds good.
and